The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud, obscuring the razor wire and wooden stakes that formed the outer perimeter of Valdris. From her watchtower, Naya Volkov pressed the binoculars against her weathered face and scanned the treeline for movement. 3 years had passed since the last infected had stumbled into their territory, yet she never allowed herself the luxury of assuming they were safe. Safety was an illusion that had died with the rest of the world. Below her, the village stirred to life with the quiet efficiency that had kept them alive when billions had perished. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, controlled streams, never too much to attract attention from above, never too little to let the cold seep into their bones. Children's laughter drifted from the schoolhouse where Lyralii Dunn taught lessons about mathematics and literature alongside more practical skills like identifying edible plants and recognizing the different types of infected by their gait. Esmeralda Korvik emerged from the council hall, her silver hair braided with strips of leather that held small metal charms, tokens from the old world that she claimed brought protection. At 73, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to conserve energy for the moments when it truly mattered. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as winter ice, surveyed her domain with the satisfaction of a woman who had kept a promise that many had thought impossible to keep. The promise had been simple: everyone who remained would survive. Everyone who followed the rules would see another dawn. It was a promise that had required sacrifices that none of them spoke about anymore, choices that lived in the spaces between their words and the shadows behind their eyes. But it was a promise she had kept. Thaddeus Grimm approached from the armory, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the main path. His left arm ended at the elbow, a souvenir from the early days when the rules hadn't been established and mistakes still carried the luxury of second chances. The prosthetic he wore now was carved from oak and fitted with metal fixtures that Mikhail Torvin had crafted in his forge. It served its purpose, though it would never let him forget the price of complacency. Naya spotted movement in the eastern quadrant, Thaddeus reported, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering both good news and bad with equal steadiness. She says it's not infected. Human, but keeping their distance. Esmeralda's expression didn't change, but her fingers unconsciously touched the largest charm in her hair, a small silver cross that had belonged to her daughter. How many? Just one, from what she can tell. Been watching us for 2 days now. The implications hung in the air between them like the morning mist. Survivors were rare, but they were also dangerous. They brought questions, disrupted the delicate balance that kept Valdris functioning, and sometimes they brought worse things: hope for a world that no longer existed, or desperation that could infect a community faster than any virus. Have Cassius prepare the quarantine chamber, Esmeralda decided. And tell Zephyrina to ready her supplies. If they approach, we follow protocol. Thaddeus nodded and turned to leave, but paused. Esmeralda, if they're alone out there and they've survived this long, they might have information we need. About what's happening in the outside world. She watched a group of children playing a game that involved throwing stones at targets painted to look like infected heads, their version of hopscotch, adapted for a world where childhood innocence had to be practical. The outside world is dead, Thaddeus. We've built something here that works because we don't pretend otherwise. But even as she spoke the words, Esmeralda felt the familiar weight of the secrets they carried settling heavier on her shoulders. The survival of Valdris hadn't been a miracle or a stroke of luck. It had been the result of choices that would have been unthinkable before the world ended, decisions that had transformed them from merely human survivors into something else entirely. In the distance, Naya's signal mirror flashed 3 times, the stranger was moving closer. Esmeralda closed her eyes and felt the weight of every life in Valdris. Every morning they had successfully defended against the darkness that had swallowed civilization. Whatever came next, she would protect them. She would keep her promise, no matter what it cost her soul. The mist began to lift, revealing the scattered bones that formed decorative patterns around the village's outer defenses. To a casual observer, they might have appeared to be animal remains, deer, perhaps, or wild boar. But Esmeralda knew better. They all knew better. The bones were human, and they served a purpose that went far beyond mere decoration. Zephyrina Vale moved through the supply shed with practiced efficiency, her hands automatically selecting the items she would need if the approaching stranger required medical attention. At 28, she had become the village's de facto medic through necessity rather than training, learning to set bones and treat infections through trial and error that had occasionally proven fatal in the early days. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a tight bun that revealed the thin scar running from her left ear to her jawline, a reminder of her first encounter with the infected and the lesson it had taught her about the necessity of absolute vigilance. She packed bandages, antiseptic solution distilled from local plants, and a small vial of morphine that represented nearly a quarter of their remaining painkillers. But it was the items she placed in the secondary bag that weighed heaviest on her conscience: leather restraints, a sedative that Cassius Brennan had synthesized from local fungi, and a single ampoule of clear liquid that served a purpose she prayed she would never have to explain to an outsider. Footsteps announced Cassius's arrival before his voice did. "The quarantine chamber is ready," he said, adjusting the wire-rimmed spectacles that he had repaired so many times they were held together more by hope and careful soldering than their original frame. "I've prepared both scenarios." Zephyrina understood his meaning without needing clarification. Scenario 1 involved treating an injured survivor and slowly integrating them into the community after a thorough evaluation of their mental stability and potential usefulness. Scenario 2 involved ensuring that certain secrets remained buried with those who might ask too many questions. "How long has it been since we've had to use Scenario 2, she asked, though she already knew the answer. 18 months. The traitor who insisted on mapping our defensive positions." Cassius's expression remained neutral, but his hands betrayed him by trembling slightly as he organized his medical instruments. He couldn't understand why that information was dangerous. The traitor had been a good man, by all accounts. He had shared news from other settlements, offered fair exchanges for goods they needed, and had even taught some of the children a card game that had brightened their evenings for weeks afterward. But he had also been curious about their survival rate, their defensive strategies, and most dangerously, their methods for dealing with the infected. Curiosity was a luxury that Valdris couldn't afford to indulge in outsiders. Mikhail Torvin's hammer rang against his anvil in a steady rhythm that had become the village's unofficial heartbeat. Through the window, Zephyrina could see his broad shoulders working as he shaped hot metal into tools and weapons that would keep them alive for another season. His workshop was a cathedral of practical miracles: plowshares beaten from the swords of the old world, cookware forged from scavenged car parts, and the specialized equipment that made their most necessary and most terrible work possible. "The children have been asking questions again," Cassius mentioned quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of Mikhail's work. "Lyralii says they're becoming more perceptive. Harder to distract when certain activities are taking place." Zephyrina felt her stomach tighten. The children were the future of Valdris, but they were also its greatest vulnerability. They had been too young to remember the chaos of the early days, the desperate experimentation that had led to their current survival methods. They accepted the world as it was without questioning how it had come to be that way. But as they grew older, their innocence was becoming a liability that threatened to expose secrets that had kept their community alive. "Maybe it's time to tell them," she suggested, though even as she spoke the words, she knew it was impossible. "They'll understand eventually. They'll have to." "Will they?" Cassius asked. "Or will they look at us the way we once looked at monsters?" The question hung between them like smoke from the crematorium that operated behind the village's eastern wall. The crematorium was another necessity that they didn't discuss openly, another adaptation that had been required for survival. The children knew it existed, they couldn't hide the smoke or the smell entirely, but they believed it was used only for the natural deaths that occurred in any community. They had never been told about the other bodies that fed its flames. Naya's whistle echoed across the village, 3 sharp blasts that meant the stranger was within the outer perimeter. Zephyrina shouldered her medical bags and tried to quiet the voice in her head that whispered about the terrible mathematics of survival. One stranger approaching their village represented either a resource to be utilized or a threat to be eliminated. There was no middle ground, no luxury of moral uncertainty. As she walked toward the main gate, she passed the memorial wall where they had carved the names of everyone they had lost in the first year of the outbreak. 147 names, each representing someone who had died because they hadn't yet learned the hard lessons that now governed their daily lives. The wall served as a reminder of why their current methods were necessary, why moral compromise was the price of survival. But it also served as a warning of what they had already lost, and what they risked losing if they forgot that their humanity was not measured by the purity of their actions, but by their willingness to preserve life at any cost. The stranger emerged from the tree lean with the careful gait of someone who had learned to move quietly in a world where sound could mean death. From the watchtower, Naya could see that it was a woman, perhaps in her 30s, carrying a pack that spoke of long travel and careful resource management. Her clothes were patched but clean, her posture alert but not aggressive. Most telling of all, she moved alone, a detail that immediately raised questions about how she had survived the wasteland between settlements. Esmeralda positioned herself at the gate with Thaddeus flanking her left side, his remaining hand resting on the grip of the machete that had served him well in countless encounters with both infected and human threats. The gate itself was a masterwork of defensive engineering, designed by Mikhail to appear rustic and improvised while actually incorporating multiple layers of protection that could channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. "That's close enough," Thaddeus called when the stranger reached the outer marker, a seemingly random pile of stones that actually marked the point where hidden pitfalls and concealed spikes began. The woman stopped immediately, her hands visible and empty, her expression calm despite being confronted by armed strangers. "My name is Isolde Raven," she said, her voice carrying an accent that suggested education and travel. "I'm seeking shelter for the night, and I'm willing to trade for it." Esmeralda studied the woman's face, searching for the tells that usually betrayed dangerous intentions. Desperation often manifested as excessive friendliness or aggressive demands. Madness showed itself in inappropriate reactions to stress. But Isolde Raven appeared genuinely calm, genuinely rational, and that in itself was cause for suspicion. Sanity was a rare commodity in the outside world. "What do you have to trade?" Esmeralda asked. Isolde slowly reached into her pack and withdrew a small metal container. "Antibiotics. Real ones, not the plant-based substitutes. And information about a horde moving through the northern valleys." The mention of antibiotics caused Cassius to straighten slightly. Their medical supplies were critically low, and bacterial infections had claimed 3 villagers in the past year. But information about infected movements was equally valuable, perhaps more so, since a single horde could overwhelm their defenses regardless of how well armed they were. "Show me the medicine," Esmeralda commanded. Isolde tossed the container forward with a gentle underhand throw that landed exactly at Esmeralda's feet. The gesture demonstrated both compliance and confidence. She was skilled enough to place the container precisely where intended, but respectful enough not to make any movement that could be interpreted as aggressive. Cassius stepped forward to examine the container, his fingers tracing the pharmaceutical markings with the reverence of someone who understood their true value. After a moment, he nodded to Esmeralda. "These are genuine. Military grade. There are at least 50 doses here." "And the information about the horde?" 200 infected, maybe more. They hit a settlement called Millbrook 3 days ago. Cleaned it out completely, then continued moving south. At their current pace, they'll reach this valley within a week." The silence that followed her words was heavy with implications. A horde of that size would require specific countermeasures, preparation that would need to begin immediately. But it also raised questions about how Isolde had obtained such detailed intelligence and why she was sharing it with strangers. "How do you know their numbers so precisely?" Thaddeus asked. "Because I was there when they overran Millbrook. I barely escaped with my life." Isolde's composure cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of trauma that validated her story. "I've been tracking them since then, trying to warn any settlements in their path." Esmeralda made her decision. "You can enter, but you'll be quarantined until we're satisfied that you pose no threat. You'll be searched, questioned, and observed. If you're hiding anything or if your story doesn't hold up under scrutiny, you'll be asked to leave. The euphemism was deliberate. Isolde would not be asked to leave if she proved to be a threat. But there was no need to make that explicit unless circumstances required it. Isolde nodded her acceptance and followed Thaddeus through the gate, passing under the archway where human skulls had been mounted to look like decorative elements. To most visitors, they appeared to be warning totems meant to frighten the infected or intimidate human raiders. But the skulls served a more practical purpose. They marked the boundary where the village's true defenses began. As they walked down the main path, Isolde's trained eye would have noticed details that revealed the sophistication of Valdris's defensive systems. The children playing in the square were actually positioned to observe the movements of any visitor and alert the adults if anything seemed amiss. The vendors at their market stalls carried weapons concealed within easy reach. Most subtly, the layout of the buildings channeled foot traffic along predetermined routes that could be easily monitored and controlled. "You've built something impressive here," Isolde observed as they approached the quarantine building. "It takes exceptional leadership to maintain this level of organization." "It takes exceptional commitment," Esmeralda corrected. "Everyone in Valdris understands that our survival depends on following certain rules without question." The quarantine chamber was Spartan but clean, containing a bed, a wash basin, and a small table. What Isolde couldn't see were the observation slots built into the walls or the mechanisms that would allow the room to be sealed completely if she proved to be infected. She also couldn't see the secondary chamber beneath the floorboards where they disposed of quarantine subjects who had failed their evaluation. "Someone will bring you food and water shortly," Zephyrina explained, setting her medical bag on the table. "I'll need to examine you for injuries or signs of infection. It's standard procedure." As the door closed behind Isolde, Esmeralda felt the familiar weight of decision settling on her shoulders. The antibiotics could save lives, and the warning about the horde could save their entire community. But accepting help from outsiders always came with risks that went beyond the merely practical. Isolde Raven knew things about the outside world that could unsettle the careful balance they had maintained in Valdris. She had seen other settlements, other survival strategies, other moral compromises. Most dangerously, she might ask questions about their own methods that would force them to confront truths they had buried beneath the necessity of staying alive. The examination revealed that Isolde was in remarkably good health for someone who had been traveling alone through infected territory. Her skin showed the expected wear from exposure and limited nutrition, but she bore none of the telltale signs of recent combat or prolonged stress that usually mark survivors from overrun settlements. Zephyrina noted the discrepancy but said nothing, filing the observation away for later discussion with the council. "You mentioned that you barely escaped from Millbrook," Zephyrina said as she checked Isolde's reflexes with a small hammer. "How did you manage to track the horde afterward without being detected?" "Experience," Isolde replied, her eyes following Zephyrina's movements with professional interest. "I spent 2 years with a military unit before the government collapsed. We specialized in reconnaissance behind enemy lines. The infected move in predictable patterns once they've fed." It was a plausible explanation, but it raised new questions about why someone with military training had been traveling alone rather than leading or joining one of the larger survivor enclaves. Soldiers were valuable commodities in the post-outbreak world, often forming the core leadership of successful communities. For Isolde to be wandering solo suggested either exceptional circumstances or careful deception. Through the small window, darkness was settling over Valdris with the abrupt finality that had become routine since the collapse of electrical infrastructure. But the village didn't truly go dark. Carefully shielded lanterns created pools of light at strategic intersections, and the watchtowers maintained constant illumination that could be seen by anyone approaching from the forest. It was a delicate balance between security and stealth, advertising their presence just enough to attract legitimate traders while avoiding the massive beacon that would draw unwanted attention from larger threats. Cassius arrived to conduct his portion of the examination, carrying the specialized equipment that would detect traces of the infected pathogen in blood and saliva samples. The tests were thorough but took time to process, requiring them to keep Isolde in quarantine for at least 12 hours regardless of her apparent health. "I've never seen testing equipment that sophisticated outside of a major medical facility," Isolde observed as Cassius prepared the samples. "Where did you acquire it?" "We've been fortunate in our scavenging expeditions," Cassius replied neutrally, though Zephyrina knew the truth was more complex. The equipment had been taken from a military research facility that they had raided in the second year after the outbreak. The raid had yielded medical supplies, weapons, and technical documentation that had proved invaluable for their survival. It had also yielded other things that they didn't discuss openly. "Most communities I've encountered make do with much more primitive methods for screening newcomers," Isolde continued. "Visual inspection, observation periods, sometimes crude temperature checks. This level of medical sophistication suggests resources and expertise that would be the envy of settlements 10 times your size." Zephyrina felt the conversation moving into dangerous territory. Isolde's questions were intelligent and focused, probing for information about their capabilities and resources with the skill of someone trained in intelligence gathering. Whether she represented a genuine threat or was simply naturally curious, her inquiries were beginning to reveal more about Valdris than was safe for an outsider to know. "We've lost too many people to take chances," Zephyrina deflected. "Thorough screening is worth the extra effort." "How many people have you lost?" The question came with deceptive casualness, but Zephyrina recognized it as a probe for information about their population, their mortality rate, and potentially their defensive capabilities. She exchanged a glance with Cassius, who had gone very still as he processed blood samples. "Enough to teach us the value of caution," Zephyrina replied. "I'm sorry if I'm prying. It's just that I've never encountered a community that seemed so stable. Most places I've visited are barely hanging on, losing people to infection, starvation, or raids. But Valdris feels different. Permanent. Like you found something that actually works long-term." The observation was astute and troubling. Isolde had identified the very thing that made Valdris unique among survivor communities: their sustainability, their confidence, their obvious expectation that they would still be here years from now. Most settlements lived day to day, constantly on the edge of collapse. Valdris had transcended that precarious existence through methods that could not bear scrutiny from outsiders. "We work well together," Cassius offered. "Common purpose, shared sacrifices." "What kind of sacrifices?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the crematorium. Outside, the evening activities of the village continued with their usual quiet efficiency: guards changing shifts, workshops securing their tools, families gathering for meals that had become ceremonies of gratitude for another day survived. But inside the quarantine chamber, 3 people sat in a silence that stretched beyond mere conversational pause. "The usual ones," Zephyrina finally answered. "Privacy for security, comfort for necessity, individual desires for community needs." "Nothing more specific?" "Nothing that would interest an outsider." Isolde leaned back against the wall, her expression thoughtful. "I apologize if I've overstepped. It's just that I've seen so many communities fail, watched so many good people die because they couldn't find the right balance between humanity and survival. Seeing a place like this gives me hope that maybe we haven't lost everything that made civilization worth preserving." Her words carried the weight of genuine emotion, but they also revealed a philosophical framework that could prove dangerous to their community's stability. Hope was a luxury that Valdris had learned to live without. They had replaced hope with certainty, speculation with proven methods, and moral idealism with practical effectiveness. "You should rest," Zephyrina suggested, gathering her medical equipment. "We'll have more questions in the morning, and you'll want to be clear-headed for them." As they prepared to leave, Isolde made one final observation that stopped them both at the door. "I noticed you don't have many elderly people here. Most communities struggle to care for their oldest members, but you seem to have found a way to manage the challenge." Zephyrina's hand froze on the door handle. The observation was accurate and terrifying in its implications. Valdris did indeed have very few elderly residents, but not because they had found better ways to care for them. They had found more efficient ways to prevent the burden of caring for those who could no longer contribute to the community's survival. "Good night, Isolde," Cassius said firmly, ushering Zephyrina through the door before any more uncomfortable truths could surface. As they walked away from the quarantine building, both of them understood that they were facing a decision that would define the future of their community. Isolde Raven was too observant, too intelligent, and too curious to be safely integrated into Valdris. But she also possessed resources and information that could save lives. The mathematics of survival had never been more challenging to calculate. The council convened in the root cellar beneath Esmeralda's house, a space that had been reinforced with steel plating and sound-dampening materials scavenged from a recording studio in the early days. The 5 senior members of Valdris's leadership sat around a table made from an old door, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls. Esmeralda spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of impossible decisions. "The medical tests confirm that she's not infected, but Zephyrina and Cassius have concerns about her questions." "Thaddeus, what did your security sweep reveal?" "Her equipment is military-grade, well-maintained, and includes items that aren't available through normal scavenging," Thaddeus reported, consulting notes written on precious paper. "Communication gear, specialized medical supplies, and rations that are still within their optimal consumption period. Either she's been extremely lucky in her salvage operations, or she's connected to a larger organization." Mikhail spoke next, his deep voice resonating in the confined space. "I examined her weapons while she was being processed. The maintenance is professional, the modifications are tactical rather than improvised, and the ammunition is standard military issue. This isn't someone who learned to fight after the outbreak. She was a soldier before, and she's remained connected to military resources since." The implications were troubling. Military survivors often came with allegiances to remnant government forces, research facilities, or paramilitary organizations that viewed independent settlements as either resources to be exploited or threats to be eliminated. Valdris had remained hidden from such groups by maintaining a carefully crafted appearance of insignificance. "What about her story regarding the Horde?" Lyralii asked. As the community's teacher and child advocate, she rarely participated in security discussions, but the threat to their children had earned her a place at this particular council meeting. "I sent scouts to verify her information," Naya reported. "They found evidence of a settlement that was overrun recently, but the attack pattern doesn't match typical Horde behavior. The damage was too systematic, too thorough. It looks more like a military operation that used infected as a weapon." The silence that followed her words carried the weight of a terrible realization. If Isolde's story about Millbrook was fabricated or incomplete, then her presence in Valdris might not be coincidental. She could be advance reconnaissance for a larger force, gathering intelligence about their defenses and capabilities before a coordinated attack. "There's something else," Cassius added reluctantly. "During the medical examination, I noticed scarring on her arms that's consistent with repeated injections. Fresh ones. Someone has been giving her regular medical treatment with sophisticated equipment. That's not something you can do while traveling alone through infected territory." Esmeralda absorbed this information while calculating the risks and potential responses. The antibiotics that Isolde had offered were genuine and desperately needed. The warning about infected movements, even if fabricated, had prompted them to review their defensive preparations. But the possibility that she was gathering intelligence for a hostile force transformed her from a potential asset into an existential threat. "We have 2 choices," Esmeralda stated. "We can attempt to extract more information from her through interrogation, which risks revealing our own capabilities if she's trained to resist questioning. Or we can implement Scenario 2 and eliminate the threat immediately." "What about Scenario 3? Lyralii suggested quietly. The others turned to look at her, confusion evident in their expressions. There was no Scenario 3 in their operational protocols. They had learned through bitter experience that complex plans failed, nuanced strategies collapsed under pressure, and moral compromises led to catastrophic hesitation in critical moments. We could tell her the truth, Lyralei explained. Show her what we've built here, explain why we've made the choices we've made, and ask her to join us rather than trying to deceive us. Absolutely not, Thaddeus responded immediately. If she's hostile, that gives her everything she needs to destroy us. If she's genuinely seeking shelter, the truth about our methods could drive her away or turn her against us. Either way, we lose. But what if she's genuinely what she claims to be? Lyralei pressed. A survivor looking for a place to belong, someone with skills and resources that could help us? We could gain a valuable community member instead of creating another enemy. Mikhail's hammer had fallen silent outside, indicating that the evening's work was complete and the village was settling into its nighttime security posture. In a few hours, they would need to make a decision about Isolde's fate, and that decision would reveal as much about themselves as it did about her. The children have been asking questions about the crematorium, Lyralei continued. About why we have so few elderly residents, about what happens to people who violate community rules. They're not children anymore, not really. They understand more than we want to admit. Maybe it's time to acknowledge that our secrets are becoming impossible to maintain. Esmeralda studied the young woman's face, seeing in her expression the moral clarity that they had all possessed before the world ended. Lyralei still believed in the possibility of choices that didn't require the sacrifice of essential humanity. She still hoped that survival could be achieved without becoming something fundamentally different from what they had once been. Lyralei, what do you think would happen if we told Isolde about the selection protocols? About the resource allocation decisions? About the population management policies? Esmeralda asked gently. I think she would understand that we've done what was necessary to preserve life. That we've made hard choices to protect the community. And if she didn't understand? If she decided that our methods were unacceptable, that we had become something monstrous in our pursuit of survival? Lyralei's confidence wavered slightly, but she maintained her position. Then we would have learned something important about ourselves. Maybe it's time to examine whether the price of our survival has been too high. The question hung in the air like smoke from the crematorium, touching on fears that none of them had been willing to voice. In their determination to preserve life, had they lost the very thing that made life worth preserving? In their commitment to protecting their community, had they become the kind of threat that they had originally sought to defend against? Outside, Naya's signal whistle indicated that the midnight watch change was beginning. Soon, Isolde would settle into sleep in her quarantine chamber, unaware that her fate was being decided by people who had learned to weigh human lives against mathematical certainties. The council would reach a decision before dawn, as they always did. But for the first time in 3 years, that decision would force them to confront the possibility that their methods of survival had transformed them into something that no longer deserved to survive. Dawn came with the sound of children practicing their morning exercises in the courtyard, a routine that combined physical conditioning with tactical training, teaching them to move silently and strike effectively while disguising the lessons as games. Isolde listened from her quarantine chamber as young voices counted out movements that were designed to disable infected attackers, their laughter mixing with the harsh reality of survival education. Esmeralda approached the building carrying a breakfast tray and the weight of the council's decision. They had talked through the night, examining every angle of their dilemma, calculating probabilities and acceptable losses with the cold precision that had kept them alive when emotion might have led to catastrophe. The conclusion had been inevitable, even if it left them all feeling something that might once have been called shame. "Good morning," Esmeralda said as she entered the chamber. "I trust you slept well." "As well as can be expected in unfamiliar surroundings," Isolde replied, accepting the tray gratefully. "Thank you for the hospitality. I know resources are precious in communities like this." "Indeed they are. Which brings us to an important conversation about your future here." Isolde set down her fork, her expression becoming more guarded. "I assume my medical tests were satisfactory?" "Completely clean. Cassius was quite impressed with your overall health, actually. It's remarkable how well maintained you are for someone who's been traveling alone through infected territory. The compliment carried an undertone that both women recognized. Esmeralda was probing, testing to see how Isolde would respond to the implication that her story might not be entirely accurate. I've been fortunate, Isolde replied carefully. And I've had good training. Yes, about that training. We've had some interesting discussions about your military background. It's unusual to encounter someone with your level of expertise operating independently. Isolde remained silent, which was itself revealing. A genuine refugee would likely have responded with curiosity about why her background was being questioned. A trained operative would recognize the shift in tone and prepare for more aggressive interrogation. I'm going to be direct with you, Esmeralda continued, settling into the chair across from her guest. We believe you're here for reasons beyond seeking temporary shelter. Your equipment, your medical condition, and your detailed knowledge of infected movements suggest connections that you haven't disclosed. What we need to determine is whether those connections represent a threat to our community. I understand your caution, Isolde said. You've built something remarkable here, and you want to protect it. But I'm not a threat. I'm exactly what I claim to be, a survivor looking for a place to belong. Then you won't mind answering some more specific questions about your recent activities. What followed was an interrogation that revealed both Isolde's professional training and the Council's growing certainty about her true purpose. Her answers were consistent but vague, plausible but incomplete. She demonstrated the ability to deflect inquiries without appearing evasive, a skill that confirmed her intelligence background while raising questions about her motives. As the morning progressed, other members of the Council joined the conversation. Thaddeus brought maps and asked for detailed information about infected movements that could only be provided by someone with access to aerial reconnaissance. Cassius presented medical scenarios that tested her knowledge of diseases and treatments available only to military medical personnel. Naya described defensive positions and asked for tactical assessments that revealed Isolde's ability to identify vulnerabilities in their security arrangements. By midday, they had assembled a profile of someone with current military connections, ongoing access to sophisticated resources, and detailed knowledge of settlement defensive strategies. Whether she represented a reconnaissance mission, a recruitment effort, or some other form of contact from outside forces, she was clearly not the isolated refugee she claimed to be. I think it's time for us to be honest with each other, Esmeralda said finally. You're here for a specific purpose related to our community's survival methods. You've been asking questions about our population, our resources, and our defensive capabilities. Now we need to know what organization sent you and what they want from us. Isolde was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through calculations that mirrored the ones the Council had been making about her. Finally, she spoke with the directness of someone who had reached a decision point. I represent a coalition of settlement leaders who have been monitoring isolated communities that have achieved unusual survival rates. Valdris has attracted attention because of your stability, your population retention, and your apparent immunity to the social collapse that has destroyed most other groups. We want to understand your methods so we can implement them in other locations. The admission confirmed their worst fears while opening new possibilities that they hadn't considered. Isolde wasn't advance reconnaissance for a hostile force, she was a representative of other survivors who viewed Valdris as a model to be studied and replicated. But that presented different dangers, perhaps even greater ones. What specifically do you want to know? Esmeralda asked. Everything. Your resource allocation protocols, your security procedures, your population management strategies, your methods for maintaining social cohesion and preventing the kind of internal conflicts that have destroyed other communities. Esmeralda felt the weight of 3 years' worth of secrets pressing down on her like physical force. Everything that Isolde wanted to know represented choices that other communities would find morally unacceptable, strategies that depended on crossing lines that most survivors still believed should remain inviolate. And if we refuse to share that information? Then I'll report that Valdris is a closed community with no interest in cooperative efforts to rebuild civilization. The coalition will respect your isolation and remove you from our monitoring lists. It was a reasonable offer, even generous by post-outbreak standards. They could maintain their privacy and continue their survival methods without interference from outside forces. But it also meant accepting permanent isolation from the larger community of human survivors, abandoning any hope of contributing to humanity's long-term recovery. "We need time to consider your proposal," Esmeralda said. "Of course. But I should mention that there are other representatives visiting other successful settlements. Your response will be evaluated alongside theirs when the coalition makes decisions about resource allocation and mutual aid agreements." As Esmeralda left the quarantine chamber, she understood that they faced a choice that would define not just their own future, but their place in whatever form of civilization might eventually emerge from the ruins of the old world. They could reveal their secrets and risk exposure of methods that would horrify other communities, or they could remain isolated and accept exclusion from humanity's collective efforts to rebuild. Either choice would require them to confront the question that Lyralii had raised the night before: had the price of their survival been too high? And if it had, was it too late to find a different path forward? The Emergency Council convened again that evening, but this time they were joined by the heads of all major families in Valdris. The root cellar had never held so many people, and the air grew thick with tension and the smoke from too many oil lamps burning in an enclosed space. This decision was too important to be made by the leadership alone. It would affect every person in their community and required the consent of those who would bear the consequences. "Before we discuss our response to Isolde's proposal, we need to ensure that everyone understands exactly what our survival methods have entailed," Esmeralda began. "Some of you have participated directly in these activities. Others have chosen not to ask questions about things they suspected but preferred not to confirm. Tonight, there can be no willful ignorance." She gestured to Cassius, who produced a leather-bound journal that had become their unofficial record of the moral compromises that had kept them alive. The book contained detailed documentation of every difficult decision, every resource allocation choice, every action that had prioritized the community's survival over individual welfare. "Population management," Cassius read from the journal. "When resources became critically scarce in our second winter, we implemented protocols for determining who would receive full rations and who would receive reduced rations based on their contributions to community survival. This resulted in the deaths of 12 individuals who were deemed non-essential." The words fell into silence like stones into deep water. Everyone in the room had lived through that winter, had known the people who had died, had benefited from the resources that their deaths had freed up for the rest of the community. But hearing it stated explicitly transformed their unspoken knowledge into unavoidable reality. "Selection protocols," Thaddeus continued reading. "When medical supplies were insufficient to treat all injured or ill community members, we established criteria for determining who would receive care and who would receive palliative comfort only. Priority was given to individuals with essential skills, reproductive capacity, or high probability of recovery. This resulted in the deaths of 18 individuals who might have survived with different allocation of medical resources." Lyralii's face had gone pale, but she didn't look away. The children in her care were alive partly because other people had been allowed to die when resources were insufficient to save everyone. The mathematics of survival had required them to make choices that were unthinkable in the old world but essential in the new one. "Threat management," Mikhail read from his section of the journal. "When community members exhibited behaviors that threatened group security or cohesion, we implemented interventions ranging from counseling to isolation to permanent removal. Permanent removal was applied in 7 cases where individuals posed ongoing risks to community survival that could not be mitigated through other means. The euphemism, permanent removal, carried the weight of actions that none of them discussed openly. There had been a man who had attempted to organize resistance to resource rationing. A woman who had tried to steal medical supplies for her sick child. A teenager who had repeatedly violated security protocols and endangered the entire community through reckless behavior. Each case had been carefully evaluated, extensively debated, and reluctantly resolved through methods that ensured the problems would not recur. Information management, Naya read. When outsiders have posed threats to community security through excessive curiosity about our methods or attempts to gather intelligence about our capabilities, we have implemented Scenario 2 protocols to protect vital information. This has resulted in the permanent removal of 4 individuals who could not be safely released with knowledge of our defensive arrangements or survival strategies. The traitor who had asked too many questions about their defensive positions. The escaped prisoner from another settlement who had tried to map their resource storage locations. The military deserter who had attempted to establish radio contact with outside forces. The missionary who had insisted on conducting formal burials that would have revealed the true nature of their crematorium operations. Each had been eliminated not out of malice or cruelty, but because allowing them to leave with dangerous information would have jeopardized the lives of everyone in Valdris. The mathematics of survival had required them to prioritize the certain safety of many over the possible innocence of few. Sustenance management, Esmeralda read from the final section. When traditional food sources proved insufficient during periods of crisis, we implemented supplemental nutrition protocols using available biomass that would otherwise have been wasted. This has provided essential calories during 7 separate food shortage events and prevented deaths from malnutrition. The room fell into complete silence as the full implications of available biomass settled into the consciousness of everyone present. The crematorium behind the village did not only dispose of bodies, it also processed them. The meat that had sustained them through their worst winters had not come entirely from hunting and livestock. The choice between starvation and survival had led them to cross the final moral boundary that separated civilization from mere existence. These are the secrets that Isolde wants us to share with other communities, Esmeralda continued. These are the methods that the Coalition wants to study and potentially implement in other settlements. The question we must answer tonight is whether we reveal the true cost of our survival or protect our secrets and accept isolation from the larger human community. Old Henrik, who rarely spoke in council meetings, cleared his throat and addressed the group in a voice weathered by decades of hard decisions. My grandson is alive because we had enough food during the winter of shortages. My daughter survived her injuries because we had medical supplies available when she needed them. I don't know if that makes our choices right, but I know it makes them necessary. But what about the children? Asked Maria Kestrel, whose 2 sons played in the courtyard every morning with innocent laughter that had not been tainted by knowledge of how their safety had been purchased. How do we explain to them that their futures were built on the bones of other people? How do we teach them to be human while showing them that humanity is a luxury we couldn't afford? Maybe, suggested Lyralii quietly, the question isn't whether our methods were right or wrong. Maybe the question is whether we can live with the consequences of revealing them or whether we can live with the consequences of keeping them secret. Thaddeus spoke for many of them when he said, if we tell other communities what we've done, they'll either try to destroy us as monsters or they'll become monsters themselves by adopting our methods. Either way, we'll have introduced more suffering into a world that already has too much. And if we keep our secrets, Cassius added, we condemn other settlements to failure, starvation, and collapse when they might have been saved by knowledge we chose to withhold. The debate continued through the night, but gradually a consensus emerged that reflected not moral certainty but pragmatic necessity. They would offer Isolde carefully edited information about their agricultural methods, their security procedures, and their social organization. They would provide useful knowledge about sustainable survival while concealing the darkest aspects of their success. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely but offered the best chance of protecting their community while contributing something to humanity's broader survival efforts. They would remain partially isolated, partially helpful, and permanently burdened with secrets that grew heavier with each passing day. As dawn approached, Esmeralda prepared to deliver their decision to Isolde, knowing that whatever happened next would force them to confront the question that lay at the heart of their existence, in their determination to preserve human life. Had they preserved anything that could still be called humanity? 3 months had passed since Isolde's departure with her carefully curated information about Valdris's survival methods. She had accepted their selective disclosure with the professionalism of someone who understood that complete transparency was impossible in a world where information could be a weapon as dangerous as any physical threat. The coalition had been satisfied with reports of innovative agricultural techniques, sophisticated security protocols, and effective community organization. They had not inquired about the methods that made such innovations possible. But her visit had planted seeds of doubt that grew with each passing day. The children had begun asking more pointed questions about the crematorium, about the memorial wall, about the stories that didn't quite add up when they compared notes with each other. Lyralii found herself struggling to maintain the careful balance between education and innocence that had protected them from knowledge that could shatter their sense of security. Esmeralda stood in the garden that had been established behind the council hall, a place where they grew medicinal plants and vegetables that required careful attention. The garden also served another purpose. It was where they had buried the ashes of those who had died natural deaths, creating a space of beauty from the remains of people who had been loved and mourned in traditional ways. But it was not where they had disposed of the ashes from their other activities. Those remains had been scattered in the forest beyond their borders, returned to the earth without ceremony or remembrance, as if erasing their existence could somehow absolve the living of the choices that had made such erasure necessary. The delegation from New Haven will be arriving tomorrow, Thaddeus reported, approaching through the garden paths that wound between raised beds of tomatoes and herbs. They're hoping to establish trade agreements and information-sharing protocols. Isolde's report apparently convinced them that we're a model community worth emulating. The irony was not lost on either of them. Valdris had become a beacon of hope for other settlements precisely because they had hidden the methods that made their success possible. Other communities looked at their thriving children, their well-fed population, their secure borders, and their social stability as proof that humanity could rebuild civilization from the ruins of the old world. They saw a future worth striving for without understanding the foundation upon which that future rested. How many communities have implemented the protocols we shared with Isolde? Esmeralda asked. 7 that we know of, possibly more. Reports indicate improved crop yields, better defensive coordination, and reduced internal conflicts. The information we provided has genuinely helped people survive. It was a source of comfort that had helped Esmeralda sleep at night despite the weight of their secrets. The agricultural techniques they had shared were innovations born from necessity but applicable anywhere. The security protocols they had described could protect any settlement without requiring moral compromise. The community organization methods they had outlined promoted cooperation without demanding sacrifices that crossed ethical boundaries. They had found ways to help other communities survive without teaching them to become what Valdris had become. But? Thaddeus prompted, recognizing the hesitation in her expression. But I wonder how long their success will last when they encounter the crises that forced us to make our hardest choices. What happens when New Haven faces starvation and doesn't have our population management protocols? What happens when they encounter hostile forces and don't have our threat management capabilities? What happens when resources become so scarce that moral considerations become luxury they can't afford? It was the question that haunted all of them. By sharing only their humane innovations while concealing their inhuman necessities, had they set other communities up for failure when circumstances became desperate enough to require desperate solutions? Were they protecting other survivors from moral corruption, or were they condemning them to death by withholding knowledge that could save them? The children have been asking Lyralii about population ethics, Thaddeus mentioned quietly. They're old enough now to understand resource scarcity, and they've started wondering why some communities fail while others succeed. She's having trouble answering their questions without revealing information we've agreed to keep private. Esmeralda nodded, having anticipated this development for months. The children of Valdris were intelligent, observant, and increasingly mature. They had grown up in a world where survival required careful thinking and practical decision-making. Eventually, they would piece together the truth about their community's methods through observation and deduction. Maybe it's time to consider Lyralii's original suggestion, she said. Tell them the truth about what we've done and why we've done it. Let them decide for themselves whether our choices were justified. And if they decide we were wrong? If they reject the foundation upon which their own survival was built? Then they'll face the same choices we faced, and they'll have to determine their own path forward. That's what growing up means, accepting responsibility for the world you've inherited and deciding what to do with it. Through the garden fence, they could see the memorial wall where the names of their honored dead were carved in stone. But beyond that, hidden in the forest, lay the unmarked graves and scattered ashes of those whose deaths had been necessary rather than natural. The children would eventually learn about both sets of remains, about the people who had been mourned and the people who had simply been disposed of. "There's something else," Thaddeus said. "The scouts have reported increased infected activity in the northern valleys. Not a coordinated horde, but significant numbers moving in our direction. We may face another crisis situation within the next few months." Esmeralda felt the familiar weight of impending decision-making settling on her shoulders. Another crisis would mean another test of their survival methods, another opportunity to choose between moral purity and practical necessity. The children would witness these choices being made, would see the machinery of survival operating without the comfortable distance of historical perspective. "Then they'll learn the truth sooner rather than later," she said. "Crisis has a way of stripping away comfortable illusions." As the sun set over Valdris, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber, Esmeralda reflected on the legacy they had built and the future they had purchased with choices that would never feel fully justified. They had preserved life at the cost of innocence, maintained civilization by abandoning humanity, and created hope by hiding despair. The children playing in the courtyard would inherit a world shaped by decisions they had not been allowed to participate in, built on foundations they had not been permitted to examine. But they would also inherit the strength to make their own choices when their time came to face the mathematics of survival. In the Garden of Remembrance, surrounded by beauty grown from ashes, Esmeralda made her peace with the possibility that history would judge them as monsters. They had kept their promise to preserve life, to protect their community, to see another dawn. Whether that promise had been worth keeping was a question that the next generation would have to answer for themselves. The last light faded from the sky, and Valdris settled into the quiet efficiency of another evening secured against the darkness beyond their borders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and new tests of the methods that had kept them alive when billions had perished. And in the morning, the children would wake to a world built on secrets that were becoming impossible to keep, in a community that had chosen survival over everything else, protected by adults who had learned that sometimes the price of preservation was the very thing they sought to preserve. The garden remembered everything. The children would too, eventually. And when they did, they would face the same impossible mathematics that had shaped their lives from the very beginning, the calculation of how much humanity they could afford to sacrifice in order to remain human.